And I suppose this brings us to the topic of satire, of what this book satirizes and what it criticizes, where its critique is aimed. And that brings us to the philosopher Leibniz.
Absolutely. We might say it first brings us to the Lisbon earthquake. In 1755, there's a topical event that inspires Voltaire. A huge earthquake hits Lisbon in 1755 and destroys about 85% of the city. At least 10,000, maybe 50,000 people are killed, no one quite knows. Earthquake followed by tsunami, followed by fires. And it's particularly ironic in Voltaire's sense because this happens while Mass is being held in church on All Souls Day, and many people are crushed while praying to God in church. And we have in this period a big debate as, with the rise of science and technology and the Enlightenment interest in reason, the question is, what causes natural events? Is there a good God who's governing everything? Or is it random? Or is it the kind of deistic world in which God is the watchmaker who built the watch and then just wound it up and it goes, and you don't look to God for every single tick of the hand on the watch?
It questions this horrible event, sort of right in the middle or on the edge of Europe, really raises to many people this question of the status of the world and its relationship to God.
And this had very much been already debated earlier in the century, the British poet Alexander Pope, and then especially the philosopher Leibniz, who becomes the source of attack.
Right. It's interesting because Leibniz, like many philosophers, struggled with the, in a sense, justification of the world in a monotheistic universe, like
and he invents the new word, right? Theodicy.
Exactly, theodicy. So how is this world justified? Because it seems like a mixed
Or literally,
bag.
how is God justified, right? It's not
That's right.
theodicy, it's the justified.
How is God justified given that the world we know is such a mixed bag, given that terrible events like the Lisbon earthquake happens? How can a good God be responsible for making such a flawed world?
So what does Leibniz think?
Well, it's tough because there would be alternative theological explanations, right? If you have a Manichaean world, you have a good principle and an evil principle, and they two fight each other. So it makes sense that you have a world in which some good things happen and some bad things happen, and that it's all a mixture.
As we've seen either with Gilgamesh or with Homer, they have no problem. Their gods are fighting each other, and so problems on Earth, well, we just take it up a level, of course. This is the way the universe works.
Right. Conflicting forces, sometimes good, sometimes bad, colliding, sorting themselves out in some way.
Now, forces colliding, we're talking almost more physics, aren't we? Maybe you could tell us something about Leibniz as a mathematician.
One of the things that I find most fascinating about Leibniz is that his thought ranges across these different domains, which we think of as very separate. He thinks about physics. He develops theories of physics and how the universe works. He thinks about mathematics. He's a pioneer in logic. But he also practices the traditional philosophical domain of metaphysics, things that can't be measured, that are not accessible to science, but that have more to do with an overall theoretical conception of the world and how it works and why it works.
Of course, in this period, science is still often called natural philosophy.
Natural philosophy, right. So there's natural philosophy, then there's metaphysics, which includes in some ways questions about God. And here we come back to the Lisbon earthquake and to what extent did it shatter people's belief in a good God, because that's the problem with monotheism. If you have one God who created the world, and if you feel like that the world is flawed in some basic way, then the question is, how can a perfect God, a God that's all-powerful, all-knowledgeable, good, create a flawed world? And that's the basic problem. The problem, or the question to which Leibniz theodicy is the answer. And it's an answer that on the face of it sounds counterintuitive. And this is, of course, what Voltaire uses for his satire, namely Leibniz claims that we live, in fact, in the best of all possible worlds. And why does he say that? Well, to some extent, it's a direct consequence of this idea that the world was created. He believes that he was a creationist in that sense. The world was created by God. And since this God is a perfect God, a good God, it must be that the world was created by this good maker is also a good world, and in fact the best possible world.
But now, how does he know that God is a good God rather than some Manichaean, not so good God?
Well, I suppose that is just a consequence of a monotheistic conception where you have only one God, where you don't have conflicting gods, where you don't have a God who delegates the making of the world, as in other theological systems, to some underling maker god, a demiurge, who is a direct employee of a perfect God, but can screw things up because he may introduce flaws into the world.
And I guess there's a kind of ontological argument also. The very idea of God requires perfection.
Exactly. That's what the idea of God in this conception is. It is a more perfect figure and therefore could not make a flawed world. But that's just the theological part of his thinking.
And how does he then account for bad things happening to good people? He's writing before this earthquake, but there have been plenty of other bad things that have happened.
Right. This conception of the best possible world is not so much an answer to how can something terrible like the Lisbon earthquake happen. For him, it's more an abstract, if you will, philosophical question that thinks about different possible worlds. And the word possible here has a real specific meaning for him because he thinks always about different possibilities, even up to alternative universes. It's a thinking that comes in part out of logic. He developed, as I said, a kind of pioneering conception of logic where he thinks about the status of different propositions. So some propositions, some sentences, some claims are true in this world, but not in another conceivable world. Some propositions are true in all possible worlds, and those are necessary propositions. Some propositions are necessarily untrue in all worlds. These are impossible propositions. So this question of what's necessary and what's not necessary, what's possible and what's contingent, something that he spent a lot of time thinking about in the logical realm, and he to some extent translates that to the physical and metaphysical realm, and that brings him to thinking about different possible worlds and coming up to the conclusion that this kind of God can only create the best possible world, even though there terrible things like the Lisbon earthquake happen.
So how does he think we should deal with these seeming mistakes, errors, faults?
I'm not sure. I mean, his value system prioritizes things like harmony, and harmony is an important philosophical conception too. Harmony, order, these are important terms. And I suppose he would say, let's try to decrease disorder and increase harmony. He is also interested in variety. These are kind of aesthetic terms, but they also have a moral valence for him.
And a physical one, of these monads, maybe tell something about that.
And a physical one, right. So he develops a kind of strange form of what we might call atomism. He thinks a lot about the smallest units out of which the physical universe is composed. He thinks about what things can you cut into smaller pieces and which can't you cut into smaller pieces. If you have a pile of stone, it's an example he uses, you can cut a pile of stone into two piles of stone and you have two smaller piles of stone. There's nothing essential lost. It's piles of stones, one big one, two small one. But if I cut you in half, I don't have two smaller Davids.
Help me get through the day on the other hand. I'd appreciate it. Send David 2 to do the next meeting.
Exactly. And after several days, your students would necessarily recognize that there's something wrong. No, so there's something essentially lost, and something that Leibniz would call a soul. So something indivisible. So there are some things like piles of stones that you can cut into smaller and smaller pieces. Others you can't cut into smaller and smaller pieces.
And this is one of the things I think we see a number of writers starting to experiment with. So Swift in Gulliver's Travels, essentially the 4 books of Gulliver's Travels, his voyages each to a different possible world. You can have floating islands. You can have people 12 times your size or 1/12 your size. And Voltaire is playing with this also. He does this early science fiction story, perhaps the first true interplanetary story, Micro Megas, a couple of decades before Candide, in which these people from Mars come and see these tiny, because they're much larger on Mars, it turns out, and they see these tiny, teensy people that they can't believe are actual people. But then they find out they can talk and have reason, despite the fact they're so tiny and think they're so important. It's a very satiric already kind of use of that sort of possible world theory.
Right. And I mean, even in Candide, the El Dorado is a kind of utopian space of sorts.
Absolutely. And in a sense, Candide is incorporating kind of possible worlds in a way that could be compared to the literature of exploration that we see with HARMWLXX2016-V008600. These are Africa is another possible world. What's that like? What is India like as a possible world? And now Voltaire is combining real-life possible worlds, say Brazil, say Portugal, say Turkey at the end, with this El Dorado utopian space, which is partly kind of a satire on Sir Thomas More's Utopia, I think.
Right.
Now becomes a kind of techno-utopia, but directly juxtaposed against the Suriname slave trade that he picks up from Afriben.
Right. It's interesting because on the one hand, so these different possible worlds, spaces show up now on a map, right? These are places you can go to. They're very hard to get to maybe, and maybe dangerous, but they actually exist on a globe.
Even some of the more imaginary ones. I have a map from 1647 that shows you where El Dorado is in Brazil. You can go there. Sadly, it wouldn't actually exist, but it's on the map.
That's right, because of course, traditionally, utopia means no place. It is, it's a kind of space that's somewhere else. It's not on the real map, but this El Dorado is something in between, right? It's somewhere located, but very hard to access,
That's right.
and you can't really find it.